Caleb didn't die in the wilderness. He walked for 40 years through the wilderness. He had to endure the consequences of everybody else's actions. But I believe those weren't a waste of time. I don't believe anything that God does in our lives is ever a waste. For 40 years, Caleb walked through the wilderness. And what happened during that time, we don't read about in the Bible at all. His name's not mentioned, but he was there. And I believe what God was doing was getting any and all of Egypt out of Caleb. Getting rid of the mindset that he was a slave. Getting rid of the mindset that he wasn't a full, complete man, that somebody else owned him. I believe God did it to heal the inside of Caleb, to help Caleb learn what it was to be a godly husband, a godly father, and a leader. Basically, God took that time, and Caleb kept working with God, becoming the man that God wanted him to be. It wasn't a wasted period in Caleb's life. Now, I'm sure there was times where he was keeping count, thinking, how many more people have to die before I get to go into God's promised land? That's human nature, right? Everybody has to die, so you're saying, who's still around today? It's been 39 years. Everybody's still here? But eventually, God fulfilled his promise. 40 years later, they all got to go into the promised land. And it's that point that we see the finishing well part of today's workshop. Caleb started strong. He started on fire. But at the age of 85, he was 85 years old when he finally got to enter the promised land. He was still as hungry and still on fire. He still had the eye of the tiger at that point of his life. And he got his promised land. Let's look at the passage here in Joshua 14:12-14. It says, Caleb, he strapped on his sword one more time, and he went and he conquered the land. And, you stop and think, how in the world did this 85-year-old man go strap on a sword and go and defeat nations of young, healthy fighters? He did it through the power of God. God was on him. God was influencing. God gave him the strength. At the age of 85 years old, he claimed the land God gave him. Joshua 14:12-14 says this. He was able to do it this way. The Lord helping me, I'm going to drive them out, just as God said. Joshua blessed Caleb, and he gave him Hebron as an inheritance. Hebron has belonged to Caleb ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly. He loved God so much that at the age of 85, instead of sitting around in his hammock all day telling the kids to stay off his lawn or talking about his arthritis, he instead strapped on his sword and he went and he fought the battle that God called him to do. And he won. And it says in the passage, he drove out all of his enemies. He left nobody. The rest of the nation of Israel, they kind of half-heartedly fought their enemies when they took the promised land. Many times you read through it that they didn't kill everybody, get rid of them. They left a few around and made them the slaves. And as you read through the rest of the Old Testament, you see eventually that decision tripped them up. And they began to follow the ways of the people in the land. They began to serve their gods. And eventually, because of their rebellion and serving these other gods, because it didn't eliminate them, God had to judge the nation of Israel. And what happened? They went back into slavery. They didn't defeat the enemy. They weren't wholeheartedly devoted to God. And they weren't grateful for the freedom that God gave them. Eventually, somebody else owned them and put them in bondage again. Caleb annihilated the enemy. He wiped them out. He left nobody around. His land was his. He owned it. Nobody could take it away.